Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, former NFL scout and currently of Sports Info Solutions, joined by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. And we have a very special guest today. Kevin Cole is with us. Kevin, what is going on?
I'm doing good. I mean, it's a very busy time of year, so I'm glad that we could hop on here and talk. And, Matt, Aaron, I'm a fan of the pod. I'm a fan of the work at Football Outsiders and Sports Info Solutions. So it's really it's an honor to be on.
Awesome. Well, we're also constantly reading your stuff. I know, very active voice in Football Analytics Twitter for sure. And I think that and we'll get here later in the podcast because we want to talk a little bit about what we can learn about real football from some of the things that fantasy, DFS people are what are the insights that those people are gleaning that can really help us understand, quote unquote, real football a little bit better. But before we get there, it has been a crazy, crazy week of NFL free agency and trades, and it's starting to feel a little bit more like the NBA the way this week has gone. But what are the main things? Aaron, let's start off. What are the biggest stories that you're looking at this week?
I would say that the biggest thing that I've learned this week is that NFL teams clearly value veteran talent based on contract differently than NFL fans on Twitter do. Because every time there's been a trade, the response on Twitter by nearly unanimously has been, "Oh my God, I can't believe that team couldn't get more for that player." And yet, that team couldn't get more for that player, right? I mean, the best example of this is actually the D Ford deal, I think. The fact that D Ford got not just a second-round pick from San Francisco, but a 2020 second-round pick. And I saw all kinds of people saying, how could you not give more for D Ford? And the answer is that NFL teams just seem to value draft picks and those cost-controlled salaries more than fans do, and they value veteran players less. Whether that's the right decision or not, that's a good discussion. But I think that we need to change our expectations for what the results of trades are going to be and lower our expectations for how much veteran players are worth a trade.
Right, like just because you can get a whole load for the RG3 trade or something like that doesn't mean that that's the correct amount that you should be getting in return. I think if teams were still getting those kinds of hauls, we would probably be saying, oh my, how could you give up that kind of a haul for that player? So I feel like no matter what, we're all going to complain and find a reason. What was your take on that, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just your Twitter fans, but probably the NFL media also. When a trade is discussed, very rarely the contracts are discussed. And I think it's Kevin Pelton may have said it when dealing with the NBA is you don't trade for players, you trade for contracts. So for instance, the D4 deal, I mean, you're trading for the right to then pay him at market value. So you're already paying market value at that point. Whether you're going to get value or not is not a guarantee. So the compensation you're going to give on top of that is almost like a cherry on top, even more risk that you're throwing in. So that's why the compensation is so low. But rarely is it framed as a trading for a contract as opposed to trading for a quality player.
And I will say that differentiates, at least as of now, that differentiates the Odell Beckham deal from the D Ford and Antonio Brown deals. Because we knew D Ford was going to need to be signed to a new contract, and that means a big signing bonus spread over your salary cap. And Antonio Brown was signed, I believe, to an extension, and that means a big signing bonus spread over your salary cap. But as of now, Odell Beckham does not have a new contract. He's still under the new contract he signed less than a year ago with the Giants, which means the Giants sucked up all that salary cap hit from his signing bonus, and Cleveland is not on the hook for giving him a new contract the way Oakland is with Brown or San Francisco is with D Ford.
Right. That adds a huge layer to this contract that makes it kind of even more crazy when you look at it. I think, Kevin, the point that you made is the right one. We can't just say they got a first and third in return. We have to look at what's the value of what they have under contract. Like in the NBA, we talk about trading expiring contracts because they have to deal with the guaranteed money and stuff like that. I think that it's got to be considered in there. And then when you look at the Odell trade, it is crazy. He's going to be making about $15 million a year. They're not responsible for any of that dead money stuff. That's all been taken off of their hands. And you look around at what's going around with Devin Funchess getting $13 million, and all of a sudden it's stealing what they did there, really.
that's where we get into the discussion where everyone's like, I can't believe that another team wasn't willing to give more. I mean, I have to admit, I doubt that Gettleman didn't go to other teams. Like, it doesn't seem realistic that he only went to Cleveland, but no other team was willing to give more than what Cleveland was willing to give. So, I mean, either Gettleman overrated Jabril Peppers and other teams were willing to give more in draft picks, but he really wanted Peppers, or no other team was willing to match a first, a third, and Jabril Peppers.
It's bizarre. You would think that somebody would want to pay, I mean, just because the contract is so good. So, Kevin, you were talking a little bit before about kind of surplus value and how that figures into these. And I think if anybody's ever done any sort of salary cap analysis before, this is something that I've spent some time on recently. Not just looking at the player value, how good is this player based on the statistics, but how good are they in relation to what they're making? And it's really remarkable. I think in any sport, really, when you start to look at this, you start to realize how valuable draft picks, or in baseball, it'll be guys in their first 6 years, any of these cost control people, just how valuable they are. And it becomes really valuable to find any sort of player being paid market value that's more valuable than that because, like Kevin said, by definition, they're getting paid market value. So there is no surplus there. That said, there's got to be some sort of surplus value to getting a player that's at the top of their position, the Antonio Browns, the real like cream of the crop. There has to be some sort of a premium that you're paying there. It's not like a linear relationship between the value of a player who's worth only $3 million a year and somebody who's worth $15 million a year. You actually have to pay a premium on the high-priced player because of the scarcity of these guys coming to the market.
What I used to say in baseball was, nobody ever lost all their games because they overpaid the best player in baseball. When people would argue in Boston about Manny Ramirez's contract, I would like, nobody ever went broke overpaying Manny Ramirez. They went broke overpaying all the middle of the road guys who weren't much better than rookies coming out of AAA. Well, the same, I think, goes for football. No one ever went broke overpaying Odell Beckham. It's players like that you want to collect. You have cost-controlled players to give you the room under your salary cap to go and get players like Odell Beckham.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I agree with you there. What else this week? Were there moves that you guys thought were really highway robbery, or any teams that you thought made particularly good or bad decisions?
I mean, I thought it was interesting what we've seen from these off-ball linebackers and the different contracts that we're seeing there. It's really driving the market. We saw obviously Quan Alexander and the deal there. That was probably the biggest one. That was a little bit of a head scratcher. CJ Mosley was even more, although I think people were expecting that. To me, a lot of these things go back to the franchise tag and how that affects negotiations. And you have in the franchise tag, you have some of these outside edge rushers who sneak into the franchise tag calculations for linebackers. And in a lot of ways, that means these guys end up hitting free agency and they're not tagged because the franchise tag amount is so much higher than it is for something like safety. And that gives them a chance to make a lot of money in unrestricted free agency. So fast linebackers are really making a ton of money.
Yeah, it's crazy to me what you just said, that they're still looking at outside linebackers and defensive ends, and they haven't really realized that edge players are edge players and off-ball linebackers are off-ball linebackers like the rest of the world has sort of. So I'm with you. It has been a thing where these linebackers, these guys have started to get paid. And for me, I think it comes down to, it's a scarce skill set, guys that can cover running backs, tight ends, that can do that stuff underneath. The linebackers with speed, the top two linebackers in the draft are the guys that ran 4.4 at the combine. So obviously it's a value, but it's kind of shocking to see the sorts of money going to these kind of non-traditional high money positions. Is that going to be something, Aaron, you made the point before, like Odell Beckham, nobody goes broke paying Odell Beckham. Historically, people do go broke paying receivers. It's maybe not great receivers, but how often do we see the great receiver winning Super Bowls? Kind of that whole argument. And I wonder with the off-ball linebackers if we're going to see that this is kind of a blip or if this is a real sustained movement.
I think people in general believe that the off-ball linebacker is not as valuable as the edge rusher or the top cornerback. And so, I have a feeling that some of these top off-ball linebackers are getting overpaid a little bit.
I'm with you there. Definitely can't argue with that one.
And definitely free agency. Free agency just involves a lot of overpaying because who is the highest paid player in the game is generally who hit free agency last. Trent Brown is now the highest paid offensive lineman in NFL history. Is Trent Brown one of the best offensive linemen even in the game right now, let alone NFL history? No.
He wasn't one of the best offensive linemen on the Patriots.
It's who gets to free agency, right? I mean, Trey Flowers, is he the best edge rusher in the game? No, he's pretty good. But he's now the second highest paid edge rusher in the game per year behind DeMarcus Lawrence on the franchise tag.
So does that mean that it's just player development? Does it almost like not matter? Because the Patriots, through their player development, I think, take somebody like Trey Flowers who didn't have a lot of value. They create all this value out of him. They're going to get a compensatory pick for him, a year from now because of this kind of stuff. Do we all obsess over free agent? Obviously, I think the first week we all would agree we all obsess over that too much. But is there something to be said that really the coaches do matter more than the personnel people in football? Is it just that the player development is going to be that much? Or do we think that the Patriots saw something in Trey Flowers and now they're just being wise to kind of sail high?
Well, I think part of it is they hit a lottery ticket, right? The draft is a bunch of lottery tickets, and this is a lottery ticket that they hit. They've had plenty of – he was, like a fourth rounder? They've had plenty of second rounders. The Patriots are almost famous at this point for blowing their second round picks. So it's not like they really draft any better than anybody else, but they hit this one, definitely. But now they feel like he's not worth 16 to 17 million per year. And so they're going to let him go and they're going to try to find pass rushing somewhere else, like Michael Bennett.
I mean, I think a little bit of it is self-fulfilling. When you hit on draft picks, then you use your cap to re-sign those draft picks, which are typically much better value than going out in free agency. So you're not going out in free agency. When you don't go out in free agency and you lose players, you get compensatory picks to draft more players. And that's what the Patriots have been better at doing than anyone else, deciding who to spend on, who to keep, who to let go, and gaining the comp picks because they don't have to spend a lot of money in free agency.
I mean, I know that it's built into the Football Outsider projection systems that we use to project DVOA every year, that losing talent on one side of the ball hurts a team more than gaining talent helps that team. And I know we've done research in the past that in general, and this is not a statement about Odell Beckham, right? This isn't true of all wide receivers. But at the wide receiver position in particular, top wide receivers tend to hurt the team that loses them more than they help the team that gains them.
Makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense, yeah. I mean, I think one part of that may be that typically the team that's gaining them does not have as strong of a quarterback and they're spending a ton of money on a great wide receiver, and potentially the quarterback was better before. I mean, I haven't personally done research on this, but I know that Brian Burke has done some research where, it's not just A plus B equals C when you get a great quarterback and a great wide receiver. Sometimes there can be even enhancing effects on that. Let's say like a Tom Brady and Randy Moss together. So hopefully Beckham and Mayfield will be that sort of situation. But I think often you see teams try to save their mediocre quarterbacks by going and getting a lot of receiving talent. And in that way, they can devalue that receiving talent.
This is where I point out that I have Baker Mayfield in a keeper fantasy football league. So yay, Odell Beckham.
That's funny stuff. All right. Well, before we get over into too much fantasy different stuff, I wanted to ask, when we look at the Browns, I think we're all agreeing that the Browns are putting together a formidable team right now. Who gets the credit for the Browns? Is this Sashi? Is this all Sashi on this, or are we of the opinion that really the execution was the execution and this is independent of Sashi?
I think that Dorsey gets some credit and Sashi gets some credit. I mean, the Sashi plan worked. It took longer than you usually want it to take, right? Because, they had to suck for 2 years, not 1 year. And you start to have guys that you drafted start to play out their contracts in a year or two. But it did what it was supposed to do. It cleared the way to add a lot of talent, both in the draft and then to use the salary cap space and to use to trade some of your draft picks to get veteran talent. But then they needed a guy to do that. And they needed a guy to negotiate with Dave Gettleman. And Dorsey deserves credit for what he's done in that area.
Yeah, I think sometimes people conflate something that's easy to do with whether or not you get lucky on something. Most people think that drafting and signing the right players is difficult. But in reality, it's difficult and it's a lot of luck involved in it. Whereas they look at something like trading back and freeing up cap space is easy to do because anyone can do it. But that's that's part of the strategy, is the fact that you can implement it. So it's something that you can do to enhance your chance of getting lucky. And I think that's what happened. I think Sashi took moves that enhanced their chances of being able to get lucky by having so many draft picks, by having so much capital. And Dorsey's done a good job capitalizing on a strong situation. I mean, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here with the Browns, but they're gonna have a lot of rookie players. They're gonna have to decide what to do with. They're gonna have a lot of talent they brought in. What's really gonna be interesting for me is a few years down the road how they negotiate that, because I think that may be the most challenging part for teams.
And we also need to admit that we have no idea how good a head coach Freddie Kitchens can be. It's a total shot in the dark because he was so good at coordinating an offense. But being a head coach is a different skill set than coordinating an offense. And we know nothing. This is a guy who was not a head coaching candidate at all before the second half of this season. And we honestly know nothing about him.
I think that, Kevin, your point about there being the controllable aspects versus kind of the parts where you need to both be good and lucky, and separating those two things out. It's something that we do in mathematics all the time. We separate kind of the signal from the noise. We can tell you how much of this is things that we can account for and how much of this is luck or things that we can't account for. We can get better at quantifying these things. And when you look at the sort of things that analytics has been clamoring for in football, I don't think it's been a certain type of player. I don't think it's even necessarily been, a real strong feeling. I don't think there's even a consensus of everybody should be passing all the time. I think everybody thinks there should be passing more. But the things that everybody agrees on are trading down historically has provided better value than trading up, trading for future picks, rolling over cap space, doing all the things, the little simple, and I guess that calling them simple kind of does degrade them a little bit, because there's simple things that everybody could be doing. But we look around the league and there's all this inefficiency going on and all of this kind of crazy management. And here was one guy who actually put the plan in place. And I think very similarly to Sam Hinkie and the way that he created a situation, it was like you create so much luck over the course of a couple of years, like future luck, it's literally what you're doing. You're trading current assets for future assets. So if you look at all of those assets, all of the cap room, all of the young players, all of the draft picks, and you add all of that stuff together, this is somebody going to play poker that entered the table with double the stack of anybody else. So I really think you're spot on. I say, certainly you give them both credit. You nailed the quarterback, which is the most important thing I think that Dorsey has done. But taking a step back, I think all of that hard work is what really created a good situation. And I also heard people point out Kansas City really wasn't so different when you look at what he inherited there.
Kansas had their cap problems since then, so that's what we're hoping that the Browns will avoid.
You just got to get out at the right time. All right, let's take a minute and let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk more about kind of the fantasy side of things, the DFS side of things. Because, Kevin, I know you're doing all kinds of research, all kinds of amazing tools that you guys create. And I'm dying to ask you this question. What can we learn about real football from the sort of stuff that you're studying?
I think we can learn a lot. For daily fantasy or even for season-long fantasy results, it really is about the results. You're getting that feedback, and then in daily fantasy, you're getting weekly feedback. So even if there are a lot of narratives flying out there about what may happen in the NFL, there's a lot of variance with what happens. Teams adopt certain strategies. Sometimes they pay off, sometimes they don't. But if you're really getting feedback all the time and your money is at risk, eventually players end up getting better. What you see is players that are really good in daily fantasy are often also good at things like poker, where it's a very much an odds and probability based game, and things have gotten better and better over time. You used to be able to play DFS and win money based upon more of a football knowledge standpoint. Now it's more and more about being able to quantify things and have the best projections and figure out how correlations and things like that. So it's just a fact-based game, and I think it is similar in real sports. It just takes a little bit longer to get there, especially in a smaller sample sport like football. In a lot of ways, the NBA has even passed the major leagues, and those sports are way out ahead. And I think it's because you get that feedback and you get those results just like you do in fantasy sports.
Way out ahead in what way?
Well, using tracking data, using a lot of the plus minus sorts of measures that they have, using a lot of the off-field stuff for sports science and things like that. The NBA is is starting to get
not the DFS players are ahead of DFS players in football, but that the teams themselves are ahead of the teams in football.
The teams themselves are ahead, but I'll also say that the DFS players, it's even more of a quantitative endeavor to play NBA DFS. Unless you are just an amazing player, it's very difficult to make money, especially in the second half of the season once everyone knows what they're going to do, because the player performance is very predictable, at least versus what happens in the NFL. And in the NFL, you have to know. You have to know from coaches, from others, who's going to get the carries now that a particular running back has gone down. You can't algorithm your way to that.
So you said before, basically in football DFS, you used to be able to rely more on football knowledge, and it's come to a point where you have to rely on the numbers now. Whereas in basketball, that ship has sailed. You couldn't get by on really NBA knowledge at this point. You would just get swallowed up by the Sharks.
Pretty much. I mean, it depends on what part of the season it is, but once the trends have established, it becomes pretty difficult. And the same thing for MLB DFS. It's extremely difficult to win unless you're using a very quantitative system. It's still 50-50 in football, but there's also a different aspect in DFS is sometimes you're playing to win a tournament. So you're trying to get that high outcome sort of play. And that's a much more quantitative endeavor, is to figure out how to be the first place out of 100,000 people as opposed to just have the best median projection.
Right. One of the most important elements of DFS that doesn't come to play when we're analyzing the actual game on the field is trying to pick players who will do well, who nobody else will pick. So you don't have just the same, oh, hey, Antonio Brown's going to go off this week against a bad defense that everybody else has. So that's obviously a major element in success in DFS.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's finding there's this whole thing about, they call players chalk if everyone has a particular player that week. So you don't want to just have the chalkiest players every week. But then again, you don't want to just have the super low on players either. It's being strategic about it. And that was what really differentiates the great players from the average players.
So I imagine when you're doing that, you're looking at variance a lot of the time, I guess, both in terms of what the players' projections might be and in terms of, how many people you would expect to pick this player. But I'm really interested in the idea of variance when we evaluate players. I think for a long time, we've been stuck on averages, and we talk about averages a lot. And we know that in the stock market, just the average is kind of useless. We want to know what the risk reward is going to be. And, you take on more risk and you have more upside at the end of the day. So you're saying these tournaments, you obviously look for that upside. And I'm wondering about that in terms of the NFL draft. For example, two of the top players, we have Quinnen Williams and we have Nick Bosa. And I think that a lot of people would have their average grades kind of similar in terms of how you would plot, what you expect their NFL careers to be. But you'd see a higher variance player in Quinnen Williams based on he's got less experience playing on the college field. We have less of an idea of what we think we can expect from him outside of there. So I'm curious, when you're when you're studying this sort of thing, when you're looking into creating your lineup for one of these situations where you need to really get that high variance group in there, what types of things are you looking at? What are the big kind of things that stand out to you in that sort of analysis?
I mean, I have a couple different ways of doing it. It depends on the sport, but a lot of the times
let's talk football.
Okay, let's talk football. But I mean, there's one way, which is looking at historical stats that you've crunched and then kind of matching them up with similar players that you have today. And you can kind of build a rough range of outcomes based upon what these historical players have done. It's a little bit more difficult with football, and it's especially challenging because the game itself changes so much over time. Obviously, we're much more of a passing league than we've ever been before. So if you're going to compare a running back and their numbers today versus a running back and what they may have done in the past, there just might not be many Christian McCaffreys out there in the past to even think about comparing. But you can use that to kind of get an idea of a range of outcomes. You want to look at that particular system that they're playing in. And then you're building in things like whether you expect them to be trailing a lot or not, and how that range can happen. You can pretty accurately project a good range of outcomes for how a final score in a game will be, and then filter down kind of in a top-down sort of manner to figure out how to allocate things at that point. And then so then when you get the extremes as far as that's concerned on different scores, then it can fall down in the extremes of how touchdowns and other things like that can be allocated.
Right, that makes sense. So as you view things, kind of cutting through the noise, you look at things more from a top-down level, try to get the game script really first, and work your way out from there in terms of how things will go.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge part of it is looking at game script, in addition to different trends for the teams. But you like I said, you're looking for those outlier outcomes. So sometimes when people look at, let's say, a total on a game that's 45 versus 40, they'll say, oh, it's only 5 points. But what you're really interested in is how often does the 45 total game end up being 55, 60, 65 points, and maximizing that sort of range. And that's quite often it's a much bigger spread between them than you would suspect, even though it's only a handful of points difference in a total.
That's fascinating. So we were talking about kind of the variance and how you can project these different things going forward. When you look at that through different sports where you can predict things a little bit better, does that change what you're looking at in those situations?
Oh, it definitely does. I mean, like a big part of it is just your confidence that you have around your projections. So your confidence intervals are going to be much smaller for other sports, in particular NBA. It's going to be a lot smaller for something like NBA. So then you're going to want to have, you need to have some of the strongest players out there. And in the instance for something like the NBA, it's really about picking out which one of the superstars you think is going to have a particularly good game that day. Whereas in the NFL and sometimes even in the major leagues, is trying to find a random receiver that may get 2 touchdowns, or like I said, if you're doing MLB, it's who may hit a home run.
That's a big difference between the NBA and other sports, because in the NBA, the top scorers of the night are usually the same guys every night, and the top rebounders are usually the same guys every night. Whereas you have a lot more like random guy hits 2 homers, random guy gets 2 touchdowns, random hockey player gets 2 goals. There's a lot more randomness with lower players having good games in these other sports.
Yeah. I mean, the usage that what they'll say for the NBA is pretty consistent. Who's taking the shots, who's getting the minutes, all that sort of stuff. So the opportunity is limited to go outside of that. Whereas in football, yeah, the targets are normally distributed to particular players, but the routes are distributed much more widely, and that opens up opportunity. And then in the major leagues, you're getting roughly the same number of at-bats no matter where you are in the lineup.
Right. So in those sports, we're really not concerned in projections with figuring out how much opportunity somebody's going to get. We're pretty much only focused on how good these players are and how we expect them to perform, I would imagine. In football, we have the total opposite case. I think if you talk to anybody that's really spent a lot of time trying to project football forward on it, whether it's a game basis or anything like that, it really is a matter of trying to figure out who's going to get the opportunity, how many carries a running back's going to get, how many targets he's going to get, rather than looking at how many yards they get on the average carry. Any kind of look that I've done with that, is that something that's been consistent with your findings?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, opportunity is king. I mean, a great example would be the Saints backfield. You could have a strong opinion on player quality, but it just happens to be that, especially in leagues where you get a point for every reception, PPR leagues, the Saints backfield is always going to be one of the top backfields in the league. It doesn't matter who you put in there. I mean, when Tim Hightower was in there at the end of 2015, he was winning fantasy championships and DFS tournaments for people. So I think that's key is knowing where the opportunity is going to go and the offense in a totality, rather than looking at the skill level necessarily of a particular player.
And now, if you'll excuse me, I have CJ Anderson on the phone.
Yeah. Another, I mean, literally off the street, right? You can bring a guy in and he can be productive. So yeah, figuring out that opportunity is huge. And obviously going to the Super Bowl, trying to figure out what was going on with Todd Gurley, whether or not he was injured, was a big thing.
Right. Okay. So that brings up another great point, and that's irrational coaches. And irrational coaches frustrate me so much, because if they behaved more rationally, then projecting football would be a lot easier. Understanding everything that's going on would be much easier. Data would be much less noisy. But coaches tend to behave very, very irrationally. Where does that come into? I mean, obviously that would come into play in terms of, wow, we really thought Todd Gurley was going to be playing in the Super Bowl. But where else does that pop up for you, where it's kind of things that you notice that come up?
Well, I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but these massive differences in how often it, run pass splits, something like that. I mean, when you look at what the Seahawks did last year, I think we heard a lot about going into the season, but sometimes it's a situation where teams are very optimistic about how much they'll run the ball, but it doesn't end up coming to pass. But Russell Wilson was so efficient on third down that they were able to implement and continue using this suboptimal strategy because Russell Wilson was so good on third down. So you might have been hoping
Russ's fault.
I guess it is Russ's fault because you kept on hoping, okay, you know what, this game, maybe they'll get down, they'll be forced to pass, and then Russell Wilson can have all these points. And it just never ended up happening because he was concentrating his stats in a very high leverage situations, which doesn't give you extra fantasy points, but it helps a lot in terms of expected points added.
So when you look at the Seahawks, for example, on a season level, looking ahead, does that make you think that Russell Wilson could be more productive this year? It sounds like he was in a lot of tough situations, dealing with a lot of third downs. Do you look at that in terms of we can expect to see some regression to the mean, and he, based on the law of averages, will see more average situations? Or are you more concerned about the coaches, and coaches tend to be consistent from one year to the next and kind of doubling down on that strategy?
I think they'll want to be consistent, but I would expect that Wilson's going to throw the ball a lot more this season. I just don't see everything coming together like it did last season, and especially when the expectations will be so low as far as the volume that you'll see from someone like him. So yes, I would assume that he's going to have to throw the ball more this year, unless they're just going to run the ball all the way through games that they're losing at some point.
Oh, please no.
Free Russell Wilson.
All right, guys. Well, we wanted to keep it quick today and get out of here, but it's been awesome talking some free agency, a little bit of fantasy, and what we can learn and how that applies to real football. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything you'd want to plug right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say check out RotoGrinders.com. I'm doing all the different projections for the different sports there, and then also some other content. I also have a side project, PredictiveFootball.com, where I have some articles where I just put together some quote-unquote real football articles and football strategy there. And then I just started up a podcast, What Would Sashi Do? It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of look at some of those questions, but really I'm just talking to football people about what's going on in the NFL.
Love it. Everybody definitely check out What Would Sashi Do? I was listening the other day, and it was awesome. All right, Aaron, anything else before we head out of here?
Just more free agency, man. We'll have to see next week who signs in the second round, because so many players go in the first few days, but there's a lot of times the values come in those next few days. Just like the second round of the draft. It's the second round of free agency where we find all that great value. All right. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Kevin, again. And we will talk to you next week. Take care.